How would you redesign Pokemon from the very beginning, from the ground up? If you could do it all differently, what would you do? That was the question that I posed in my last video, where I looked at the mechanics of how a game that I would design, similar to Pokemon, would play. In this video, I want to focus on types. I have made a lot of videos about different Pokemon types, how I would fix them, how I would change them, which types are strong and which types are bad. Typing is something I've always been really obsessed with in the games. I think it's such a core mechanic to how the game plays. But there's always going to be some issues with how I'm changing things. Just because we've had Pokemon for so long now, it can be hard to envision how these changes would be implemented. This is why I want to start from the ground up, with no history, nothing weighing it down. This video was brought to you by the members of the Crustacean Association, Finnegan Cleary, Aidan Tawney and Bill B. Thank you for your support. If you're a viewer who would like to support the channel even more than you already do just by watching the videos, I would greatly appreciate it if you considered becoming a member. In Pokemon, there are currently 18 different types, or 19 if you include the Stellar type, but I don't really want to include that because I don't think that will stick around for too much longer. It feels a lot like a Paldea specific gimmick. Pokemon's types are currently responsible for both defensive and offensive interactions with other types. This means that they have properties on both sides of the spectrum. Offensively via things like moves, which all have different types and therefore different levels of effectiveness, and defensively via the type chart and some other things like inbuilt immunities to certain aspects of the game. I always think of typing being the most fundamental mechanic of Pokemon because pretty much everything else is informed by typing. It's the first thing that we learn about, and it's the first thing that we often think of when we think of these Pokemon. It's such a vital part of how the game is played. Other creature collectors have a different way of dealing with different types. I specifically want to look at Coromon, where you have separate types for different types of interactions. In Coromon, you can have a defensive body type, which is the type that your Coromon actually has, and then you have attacking types like the cutting type or the heavy type. A creature can't be cutting or it can't be heavy, but these only exist in moves. Quite confusingly, in Coromon, some of the body types are also attacking types. I do think that this is quite an interesting mechanic. However, I do prefer Pokemon's types, as they kind of also have attacking types in the form of move categories. Move categories are, as the name suggests, categories for moves. They're like families of moves that can be independently influenced without them having to be part of a singular type. The move category system in Pokemon allows for a bit more move variety between moves of the same type. You can have two different moves that kind of work the same, but if they have different categories, they could work differently for different Pokemon. A great example of this is the Pokemon Toxtricity. Toxtricity's ability to use sound-based moves, way stronger than everyone else's sound-based moves, means that it's able to run moves like Boom Burst or Overdrive, whereas normally you wouldn't use a normal move as a coverage option and you would use Thunderbolt as the generic electric attack. It just adds a little bit more flavour to the Pokemon, that they're not just another electric type special attacker, but they're specifically a sound-based special attacker. I would take this move category system from Pokemon, and in a way to kind of emulate how Coromon works, I would expand it out to most moves. So even a basic move like Scratch now becomes a slashing move, or another basic move like Tackle becomes what I would call a charging move. I'd give these type of moves smaller bonuses or slightly different mechanics to help differentiate them from other moves, so it feels as though you're doing something different. If you watched my last video, I talked about using a 2D hexagonal grid for how my games would be played. This could work really well with the move categories. For example, I imagine that slashing moves would also deal damage to any Pokemon adjacent to your target, or a charging move would need a run-up in order to hit the full effect. It would mean that while on a numbers perspective these moves are similar, they actually do slightly different jobs in how they play. Currently in Pokemon, dual types have a natural offensive edge against the single types, as they have access to 2 stabs compared to 1. Now defensively they could get worse, but they could also get better, so I would say that in general dual types are a benefit to Pokemon compared to singular types. There are 1025 Pokemon that currently exist, and 520 of those have single types. Only 8 single-typed Pokemon are currently in Overused at time of recording. Now, I'm not saying that I would expect it to be half of the Pokemon in Overused, as evolutions do tend to gain another type, so I imagine that in that 520, there is a lot of not fully evolved Pokemon, but there's still a major discrepancy between these two that indicates that having 2 types is better than 1. I should also point out that one of those single-type Pokemon in Overuse is Cinderace, who doesn't really work on a kind of single type thing because they can change their type. They still maintain that they're a single type Pokemon, but a big part of them is that they can change type. I think that there should be something that compensates for this and gives some single type Pokemon a bit of love to have them interact differently. The most obvious way to do this is to give them an increase in stab power. Now, I definitely wouldn't say to double stab, as it's incredibly powerful. Look at some Pokemon like Lokix or Crawdon. These are Pokemon known for punching giant holes in teams, even though my beloved Crawdon has sadly fallen off a bit from its heyday. In my game, I'd just go with a 1.33 boost, which you might think, hey, that's lower than the current stab. This is because in my last video, I talked about slightly slowing down the game during the attacking calculation. I would limit traditional stab for a double-typed Pokemon to just 1.25. and make it for single-type Pokemon 1.33. At first glance, this would mean that coverage moves would become a lot more common, so I feel as though there would have to be a change to how effectiveness works in order to compensate for this. In a game where you're always going to have 2 Pokemon be attacking at once, I would want to make it so that moves in general do a bit less damage. For super effective moves, I'm just going to lower it down to 1.5, and for extremely effective moves, I would just make them a straight up double. For not very effective, I'd take this down to 0.66 or 0.67, and extremely not very effective moves would just be 0.5. This means that in general, hitting super effective isn't as important as it was before. Super effective will still deal more damage, but hitting an extremely super effective attack will not be a guaranteed OHKO like it essentially is in Pokemon. The only type interaction I didn't talk about there was immunities. In Pokemon, immunities are incredibly important, and several types would be unstoppable without them. Dark, Fairy, and Ground are all defined by the fact that they have a specific immunity that basically keeps their opposite type in check. If you don't have one of these Pokemon on your team, you're really going to struggle to find another counter to these threats. I really do like this design mechanic about the immunities, but I've never been a fan of the fact that they completely stop all progress. At least on a resistant hit, there's still a little bit of progress and the game still changes somewhat. But on an immunity, no progress is being made, and it essentially becomes a fight to get rid of your immunity. Because of the aforementioned value of Pokemon with immunities, it means that they become really important to your team. So I think that if you're going to do immunities, you need to make sure that other types have similar mechanics that grant them a reason to exist on your team. Essentially, the types that don't have immunities need to have really good reasons why you would use them and why they are as important as the Pokemon that have immunities. I also think that when adding immunities, we can do a much better idea than just having all of them based off typing. Pokemon does it to an extent with Grass being immune to powder moves, but I'd like to incorporate the type categories much more into the immunities. So for example, a Ghost type would be immune to something like a punching move. Now, if you're a smart cookie, and I like to think that you are as you're watching this video, you might be able to see that this would create a situation where double types are now inherently better, not because of their offensive situation as is the case in Pokemon, but from their extra utility. With this emphasis on stronger mechanics, you're going to have dual types who have 2 strong effects associated with their types, whereas single types will just have the 1. This is a very tricky problem I've found to balance. The first option would be to just limit these mechanics to just single types, but I think that that would ruin a lot of the flavour of double types. A big part about them is that you're getting the best of both the types, and so if you only have it in the single types, does it really feel as though you're using both of the types? The second option would be some sort of defensive buff to the single types, but I don't think that this would be too great either. Double types can be just naturally worse than a single type option, and some single types like Water or Fairy are exceptional. So once again, I don't think that this is the way I would go. You could talk about limiting the buffs or the mechanical changes for a double type, kind of like how they've been watered down in our idea of how stab would now work. But a lot of the mechanical changes I have in mind are kind of binary. They're things like immunities or changes to how they would move on the board. So I don't think it would work this way. It's hard to get a way where you can be more immune to something without it just being that they're healing by it. I don't like the idea of single types being able to heal from just specific attacks, because then it would be such a slower metagame. I think that the best way to handle this is just to accept it. To me, it makes complete sense that a dual-typed Pokemon is going to have more going for them than a single-typed Pokemon. It does give some dual-type Pokemon advantages, but they could also be hampered by a bad typing, or they could really appreciate that attack boost from being a single typing. There's always going to be some outliers, and I think that there's going to have to be some things that are just accepted. Finally, I want to talk about type uniqueness. Uniqueness is something that I think is vital in Pokemon, and it does it to a certain extent. Some types have really specific ways of playing that make them specifically fit into a specific role. Poison types are often bulky and stall orientated, fighting types hit hard physically, and water types are generally good at most things. Pokemon manages to achieve this through a variety of different means. One of the ways that they do it is by the type chart, which pushes certain Pokemon towards prominence and means that other Pokemon are gonna fall behind. Steel is the type with the most amount of resistances, a comedically large number of resistances if you ask me, so it naturally lends itself to being a defensive type. Compare this to Ice, which is the type that has the least resistances, so the best Pokemon in it are the offensive ones. I think doing it this way does have quite a lot of flaws behind it. For one, having an absolutely amazing defense is probably better than having a good attack. This is because the offensive steel types still have access to that amazing defensive profile that they have, so they can do things like coverage to make up offensively for the type. The same can't really be said for ice types, as the defensive ice types can't really get by at all due to the terrible defenses that they have. Yes, it makes fast, offensive ice types really good, but it also leaves a lot of the slower and defensive ice types out in the cold. This is a thing that I completely hate in Pokemon, and I've made many videos on it before, so I won't go into that much detail. Another way that Pokemon creates type variety is through the design of the Pokemon and the moves that they have. Psychic types and Dragon types are full of really powerful moves, and they have some really powerful offensive Pokemon. This makes them really, really good as an offensive power type, just a type designed to do massive amounts of damage all at once. Compare this to the Bug type, a type filled with weaker base stat total Pokemon, but some more unique moves that make it a unique type that has to play in a very weird and unique way. Many bug types have access to strategies that just other types do not learn. Again, I do think that this has some flaws to it, specifically with the bug type, because it has such a reliance on specific unique moves. You generally get a scenario where one or two of them that can use these moves to the best rise to the top and everyone else falls to the bottom. As without these moves, these Pokemon are not very good. Again, if you're interested in hearing me talk more about that, I have made another video on it. Just don't want to go into as much detail as I did on that video. Finally, we have doing it through unique mechanics. The flying type is unaffected by a lot of mechanics in Pokemon due to them being naturally ungrounded. This makes them really good at filling roles like being a pivot, as they can switch in on some of the most common moves and avoid having to deal with things like spikes. Another example is the fire type being immune to burn. This makes fire types a great option as physical attackers or just to soak up fire type moves, as they don't have to worry about being burnt, which would completely decimate another physical attacker. I like all of these three methods, but I do think that the idea of mechanical changes and unique mechanics for types is the best way to go. It also links back to the idea of when some types should have an immunity, other types should gain really strong mechanics to break away from that immunity. I think if every type had something really unique that only they could do, it would really help set the different types apart from each other. And whilst I would use some of the other methods to create variety between different types, this would be the main thing that I would go with. I would like the different types to feel very different from each other, as though they do different things. It would make variety in a team really important, as you just want to have as many mechanics as you possibly can to deal with different things that could arise. If you have enjoyed this video or would like to see more on this specific topic, I hope that I've earned a like or a subscribe from you. Also, these are not things I'm suggesting for changes to Pokemon, but rather changes for a new game that I would develop. It's all theoretical, I'm just using Pokemon as it's a familiar medium. Thank you.